I decided to go camping alone in the woods for the first time. I needed a break from city life, and spending a night under the stars sounded perfect. I found a spot near a small, calm lake, surrounded by thick trees. It was quiet and peaceful. After setting up my tent, I gathered some wood and started a campfire. The crackling fire was comforting as the sun began to set. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, reflecting beautifully off the water. I cooked a simple meal and enjoyed the quiet. Everything felt perfect. As darkness fell, I heard the sounds of the forest coming alive. The hooting of an owl, the rustling of leaves, and the distant croak of frogs filled the night. I felt a bit uneasy but told myself it was just the normal sounds of the woods. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, until I felt tired. I put out the fire, zipped up my tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The night was cooler than I expected, and the only light came from the moon shining through the trees. I woke up to a strange noise outside my tent. It was a low, growling sound, unlike anything I had ever heard. My heart raced. I lay still, listening closely. The noise continued, getting closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. Something big was moving outside. I quietly reached for my flashlight and my camping knife. My hand shook as I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The sound stopped. I strained my ears, trying to hear any movement, but there was only silence. After what felt like forever, I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The night was still and quiet again. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I decided it was probably an animal, and that I was overreacting. I closed the tent and lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound seemed louder, keeping me on edge. Eventually, I got so tired that I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming into the tent. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside carefully. The area around my campsite looked undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. I packed up my gear, ready to leave the woods. As I was folding my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were large footprints in the dirt, much larger than any human or common animal. They led away from my campsite and into the deeper parts of the forest. I decided not to stick around to investigate further. I finished packing and hiked back to my car as quickly as possible. The whole way back, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, a wave of relief washed over me. I drove away from the woods, vowing to never camp alone again. The peace and quiet I had wanted turned into a night I would never forget, a reminder of how small we are in the wild. I made it home safely, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever made those footprints was still out there, watching. From then on, I always made sure to camp with friends, never alone. Nature is beautiful, but it has its own rules and dangers. Sometimes, when I lie in bed at night, I can still hear those footsteps crunching in the leaves. I wonder if it followed me home, waiting for the right moment to remind me that out there, in the dark, I'm never truly alone. I had always liked the idea of spending a weekend alone in a cabin far from everything. The thought of getting away from the constant noise and rush of the city for a few days seemed perfect. So, when I found a small cabin for rent deep in the woods, I booked it without a second thought. The drive was long and twisty, but the scenery was beautiful. Tall trees lined the narrow road, and the only sounds were the occasional bird calls and the hum of my car's engine. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just as perfect as I had imagined. It was a small, wooden house with a porch that overlooked a clear, sparkling lake. The first day was peaceful. I spent the afternoon reading a book on the porch, occasionally looking up to enjoy the view. As the sun set, the sky turned bright orange and pink, and I felt completely at peace. I cooked a simple dinner and settled in for the night. It was around midnight when I first heard it. A soft rustling sound, like something moving through the leaves outside. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or a deer. But then, the sound got louder, and I could hear footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps, crunching the leaves and twigs outside the cabin. I froze, listening carefully. My heart started to pound, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I reminded myself that I was in the middle of nowhere. It could be anything. But the footsteps continued, moving closer to the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought with me and slowly moved towards the window. Peeking through the curtain, I looked out into the dark forest but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, trying to calm my racing thoughts. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, maybe an animal passing by. The next day, I tried to forget about the night before. I went for a hike, explored the woods around the cabin, and took some pictures of the beautiful scenery. But I couldn't stop thinking about the sound of those footsteps. That night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I went to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would help me feel better. But around midnight the footsteps came back. This time, they were louder and closer than before. I could hear them walking around the cabin, slow and steady. I sat up in bed, holding the flashlight tightly. The sound of the footsteps stopped right outside the front door. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare move. Then I heard the soft creak of the porch floorboards, followed by a light tapping on the door. Fear gripped me. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. Whoever or whatever was outside, I didn't want to find out. I waited until the sound stopped, and the silence stretched on for what felt like hours. When I was sure it was safe, I quietly gathered my things, grabbed my keys, and made my way to the car. The drive back felt endless. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the road stayed empty, and I eventually reached the highway. When I got home, I felt a wave of relief. I never found out who or what was outside the cabin that night. But the thought still haunts me. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear those footsteps in my mind. Slow, deliberate, getting closer and closer. And I wonder if someday, they'll find me again. I went camping alone in the woods, far from any town or other people. I always loved the peace and quiet of nature, and this trip was meant to be a break from my busy life. I set up my tent near a small open space and started a fire. As the sun began to set, I felt a strange unease. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just being paranoid. After dinner, I sat by the fire, enjoying the sounds of the forest. The crackling fire, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, it was perfect. But then, I noticed something weird. The usual sounds of the forest seemed to stop. The rustling leaves were silent, and the owl didn't hoot anymore. It felt like everything was holding its breath. I decided to go to bed, hoping sleep would come quickly and calm me down. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, lying down in my sleeping bag. The silence outside was creepy, but I tried to ignore it. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the steps were slow and deliberate, getting closer to my tent. I lay still, barely breathing, trying to hear every sound. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I reached for my flashlight and shone it towards the tent wall. The light cast shadows, but I couldn't see anything. Then, the tent fabric moved slightly, like something or someone was brushing against it. I froze, my mind racing with thoughts of who, or what, could be out there. Suddenly, the zipper of my tent started to open. My heart was in my throat. I grabbed my knife, my only means of defense, and waited. The zipper opened a few inches, then stopped. There was silence for what felt like forever. Then, the zipper quickly zipped back up, and I heard the footsteps walking away into the woods. I lay there shaking until dawn. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up my gear and left. I didn't look back. I never found out what or who was out there that night. The woods felt different now, no longer a place of peace, but of hidden dangers. I decided that was my last solo camping trip. The feeling of being watched, of being vulnerable, stayed with me long after I returned home. Weeks later, I was watching the news when I saw a report about a missing person last seen near the same woods where I camped. The thought that I might have had a close encounter with whoever was responsible made my blood run cold. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. The image of that slowly opening tent zipper haunts my dreams, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I think I hear those footsteps again. It was a calm evening when I set up my tent in the thick forest. The air was cool, and I could hear all sorts of sounds from nature. I had been hiking for hours and was looking forward to sleeping under the stars. Being alone in the woods was peaceful, and I felt free. After a simple dinner, I decided to go to bed early. The forest was dark, and the only light came from the moon and my small campfire. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the crickets and the leaves rustling. The forest felt alive, but I was used to these sounds. They were normal, even comforting. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black, and the fire had gone out. There was a weird silence, the kind that makes you feel uneasy. I tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard it. A faint, uneven crunching sound. It was slow, like footsteps on dry leaves. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound was too heavy. My heart pounded as I listened closely, trying to figure out what it could be. The steps got closer and stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, trying to hear any movement. The forest seemed to hold its breath too. Then, there was a soft scraping against the tent fabric, like someone or something was feeling around. My mind raced. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I could feel someone outside, a sense of being watched. The scraping continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably just minutes. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The forest was silent again. I waited, not moving, listening for any sign of the intruder. Eventually, I got so tired that I fell back into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was dawn. Light filtered through the trees, and the forest was alive with morning sounds. I slowly unzipped my tent and looked around. There were no signs of anything strange. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of place. It was as if the night had been a bad dream. But as I packed up my gear, I noticed something. On the ground, right next to my tent, was a single, muddy handprint. It was human, and it was fresh. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly finished packing and started my hike back to civilization, the feeling of unease never leaving me. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. Part of me wants to believe it was just a prank, maybe another camper messing around. But the memory of that handprint, and the feeling of being watched, stays with me. When I got home, I looked up stories about people disappearing in the woods. The more I read, the more I realized how many of them talked about strange noises and muddy handprints. It wasn't just me. Whatever was out there, it was real, and it was watching. That handprint was a reminder that sometimes, the most frightening things aren't ghosts or monsters, but the unknown, lurking just outside our safe spaces. And that night in the forest, I came face to face with that unknown. The night was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. I'd been camping alone for 2 nights, and while I was used to being alone, the silence was unsettling. The campfire crackled softly, its weak light casting strange shadows on the trees around me. Around midnight I heard something. It was a faint, unmistakable sound, like the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I told myself it was just the forest settling down for the night. Animals are known to wander, right? I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling and crawled into my sleeping bag, letting the dying embers of the fire glow faintly. Hours later, I woke up suddenly. The noise had come back, and it was closer this time. My heart raced as I lay still, straining to listen. The footsteps seemed to be moving in circles around the campsite, with the crunches and pauses forming a strange pattern. My flashlight was next to me, so I reached for it carefully, trying not to make any sudden moves. When I turned on the light, the beam cut through the darkness. I looked around the campsite but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the familiar shape of my tent and the smoldering remains of the fire. Despite this, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I decided to check things out, grabbing a stick for protection, even though I knew it wouldn't be much help if there was really someone out there. I stepped out of the tent and looked around. The footsteps had stopped, and the only sounds were the occasional crackle of dying embers and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. I walked slowly around the edge of the camp, the flashlight cutting through the dark. Everything seemed normal, but the tension in the air was thick. Then I saw something. Not far from my tent, partially hidden under a bush, were large, muddy footprints. They were definitely not mine, too big and too deep. They led off into the forest, disappearing into the underbrush. My stomach twisted as I realized someone, or something, had been watching me. I quickly packed my gear and decided to leave. There was no way I was staying another minute. As I hurriedly packed, every little sound seemed magnified, and the dark forest looked even more menacing. The walk to my car felt like it took forever, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves making me jump. When I finally reached my car and drove away, I glanced back at the dark outline of the forest. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the tension easing only when the trees were far behind me. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped something far more terrifying than just strange noises. It wasn't until I got home and checked my gear that I noticed something chilling. One of the muddy footprints was now in the back seat of my car. The unmistakable print was fresh, and it was clear that someone, or something, had been following me all the way to my vehicle. We were deep in the woods, miles away from any town. My friends and I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. We wanted a break from the city, to enjoy nature, and just unwind. At first, everything was perfect. The weather was ideal, the sky was clear, and the forest was calm. The first day went by without a hitch. We set up our tents, gathered wood for the fire, and cooked dinner over it. We laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed the evening. As the fire burned low, we decided to head to bed and went to our tents. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It was a faint rustling, like something moving through the leaves. I thought it was just a small animal and tried to go back to sleep. But then I heard it again, and it was closer this time. I sat up, straining to hear better. The rustling now had a low, steady crunching sound with it, like footsteps on the ground. I unzipped my tent and looked outside. The moonlight made long shadows through the trees, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. I listened carefully, my heart racing. The footsteps were getting closer, moving slowly but surely toward our campsite. Feeling scared, I grabbed the flashlight next to my sleeping bag. I shone it in the direction of the noise, but the light only revealed trees and darkness. The footsteps were now only a few feet away. I called out to my friends, but there was no answer. They were all sound asleep, unaware of the danger. I decided to check it out, hoping to find a reasonable explanation for the noises. I stepped out of my tent, trying to be as quiet as I could. The night air was cold, and the forest was eerily silent except for the crunching of the footsteps. I moved toward the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I froze and swept the area with my light. There was nothing, just trees and shadows. A shiver ran down my spine, and I decided to go back to the campsite. As I turned around, I saw something on the ground, fresh footprints, larger than any of ours, leading away from our tents and into the darkness. I rushed back to my tent, my mind racing. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, listening for any sign of movement. When the sun finally came up, I woke my friends and showed them the footprints. They were just as confused and uneasy as I was. We quickly packed up our gear and left the forest. The drive back was quiet, each of us lost in thought. The feeling of being watched, of something hiding in the shadows, lingered with us. We never found out who or what was out there that night. As we left, we noticed that the forest seemed even more oppressive and dark. It was as if it was hiding something that didn't want to be found. And we were all too relieved to be out of its grasp, hoping that whatever had followed us wouldn't dare come near us again. I decided to go camping alone for a weekend to clear my head and enjoy some quiet. I found a spot deep in the forest, far from any town. The first day was great. I set up my tent, collected firewood, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun went down, the forest around me got dark and silent. I felt calm as I watched the fire. That night I slept well. The sounds of the forest were relaxing. The next day, I walked around the area. I found a small stream and followed it for a bit. It was a beautiful, sunny day, and I felt at peace. When I got back to my campsite, I saw something strange. My backpack was open, and some of my food was gone. I thought maybe an animal had taken it, so I tied my things up better. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard rustling in the bushes. I thought it was a small animal, but the sound didn't stop. It seemed to be getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the noise. There was nothing there. I felt nervous, but I tried to brush it off. Eventually, I went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to a loud snap. My heart pounded as I listened. It sounded like footsteps. They were slow and heavy, moving around my tent. I held my breath, hoping it was just my imagination. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could see a shadow through the fabric. It was a person. I didn't know what to do. I stayed as still and quiet as I could. After what felt like forever, the shadow moved away. I waited a long time before I dared to unzip my tent and look outside. There was no one there. I packed my things as quickly and quietly as I could. I didn't care that it was still dark. I needed to leave. As I hiked back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound made me jump. When I finally reached my car, I felt a huge sense of relief. I drove away, my hands shaking. But as I turned onto the main road, my headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the forest, watching me. I don't know who or what it was, but I realized then that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Now I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched, even at home. Every creak, every rustle, sends chills down my spine. Camping alone seemed like a good idea, but now I know some places are better left alone.